Good evening, everybody. My name's Roger Jones. Some years ago I used to teach philosophy and adult education in places like the Working Men's College in Camden and City. I haven't done that for a while, but I've been fairly active in the various informal philosophy groups that have been around the last few years. So what I'm going to talk about tonight is, can the term spiritual have a meaning in a world where God is dead? And I'm going to relate that, amongst others, to Nietzsche and just a little note on Jung and a few other thinkers too. Can you hear me at the back? Yes. Good.
Should I close the door, do you think?
Yeah, well, someone near the door could close it. Thanks, Michael. So the last meeting here, which was just over a month ago, I think, Nash had talked about how for those following Nietzsche, the aesthetic, let's not get aesthetic and aesthetic mixed up. Aesthetic is looking at beautiful things. The aesthetic is the sphere of judgment or of peak experience that Nietzsche thinks will take us out of the humdrum or the everyday. Somebody in the audience, I think, is here. I think it's Toby.
Yeah.
Asked us the aesthetic could be a way to the spiritual, and that kind of inspired me to ask this question: does this term, or can this term spiritual, have any kind of meaning? If I say in a world in which God is dead, we can just take that as meaning in a post-Nietzschean world. Some people, of course, think that the term spiritual would have no meaning in a Nietzschean world, and that's something we might want to discuss. So I thought I'd say a little bit about why I found Jung and Nietzsche important to me personally. And this is more of a personal and an academic view, so I'm kind of, to some extent, saying why I find these thinkers interesting. So when I started to study Western thought, which in my case was a mixture of politics and philosophy, so in my sort of teens and 20s I was trying to work out what my critical approach was. And intuitively I thought too much emphasis in the Western canon was given to reason and empiricism. So whilst looking around for critiques of the dominant ideology, at that time many others, my contemporaries, were getting into Marx and left-wing thought, which has its attractions. Yet somehow, with its scientific claims and lack of subjectivity, Marx and the kind of Marxists didn't really cut it for me. So one of the reasons I was attracted to Nietzsche is his critique of simple ideas of truth. And along with that, Christianity as an ideology to serve the weak. And also Nietzsche, and I better just say roughly at the time, Nietzsche was writing after Hegel, after Schopenhauer. And one of the thinkers that influenced Nietzsche, apart from Schopenhauer, was a chap called Feuerbach, who's known as a young Hegelian. He was somebody who followed Hegel but was critical of it. And Feuerbach came up with this idea that the notion of God is a projection of the human, let's call it spirit, shall we, for the sake of this evening. So Nietzsche takes on Feuerbach's idea that the idea of God is actually part of us that we're projecting onto some being in a far-off world. But the big idea, I think, that attracted to me with Nietzsche was the idea of the Apollonian and Dionysian split in consciousness. Now this is usually referred to the arts, but I'm going to apply it to thought in general. So Apollo, from where the word Apollonian comes from, the god Apollo, symbolised rational thinking and order. Dionysus, of course, was the god of wine and joyousness, represents irrationality and chaos. So what Nietzsche thought had happened in Western art, but I'm going to suggest in Western thought, is that there is this split between the rational and, if I just say, the other aspects of humanity. I mean, well, we'll talk about that a bit more in a moment. Another of Nietzsche's useful criticisms is to do with the idea of the mental. Now, there are a couple of baddies in this story, who, to my mind, who are the baddies? Well, Plato and Descartes, really, who have led us down a massive cul-de-sac. Although, having said that, as so many people have said, everything really is a footnote to Plato, including Nietzsche, who spends a lot of his time pulling Plato to pieces, which is the same kind of thing as being in love, I suppose, with the philosopher, isn't it? Anyway, I mean, you know, I mean, generally one is attracted to the bits of oneself that one is not aware of yet, or something like that. But I might be jumping ahead to the Jungian part, which somebody else is talking on. Both Plato and Descartes are dualists, that they think that there is more than one world, if you like. There's the physical world of touch and so on. Plato has his world of forms. This is not the place to have a massive discussion on it, but you know, in general, people treat these as real, as though the character Socrates really did have a theory of forms, and that exists aside from our physical world. Descartes was most well known for his "I think, therefore I am," and his idea that our consciousness is mental, and that there is a radical discontinuity between the substance of the mental consciousness and the substance of the physical. However, Cartesians thought this idea of the self as primarily mental, that having no physical aspects, has become so much part of our culture that it's almost interwoven it's interwoven with Christianity, for example. So Nietzsche, in his criticism of asceticism, that's the one where people deny themselves things, not the one where people go around looking at pretty things. So Nietzsche's critical of asceticism because it denies the body. So, you know, an ascetic might be somebody who sits on a pole for months on end or something. Nietzsche's not too keen on that. Actually, Nietzsche was more critical of Christian asceticism and also Christian mysticism. But the point is that Nietzsche is not a dualist. In some of the books I was reading, somebody referred to him as a radical materialist. But I think a safer word to use would be a non-dualist, because I don't want to make any claims for materialism in the same way that other people might make claims for a spiritual or so on. So I'm just going to say it's a non-dualist. One of the things I did find reading around for this talk, and it became very clear to me that Nietzsche has been such an inspirational writer, because reading so many people who were writing about Nietzsche or been inspired by Nietzsche, it's quite clear that in their battling with Nietzsche, that they're trying to transcend their own ideas or trying to transform themselves. And I think this actually is one of the ways that Nietzsche is very inspirational. It's difficult to be reading Nietzsche seriously and not have your own thoughts, I would say, heightened or inspired, or find that you have to go around actually transform some things in order to actually get anywhere with that. So Nietzsche's a catalyst for transformation. How about that? Jung, following in the footsteps of Nietzsche, clarifies aspects of the psyche further. Now remember I said I was very attracted to the Apollo-Dionysus split. I'm going to say that Jung has some ideas, what he calls functions of thinking, feeling, sensation and intuition. So this is kind of breaking down that split even further. From these Jungian functions, I would say what in general official Western thought, or shall we say the Anglo-American idea of Western thought anyway, is very much based on the functions of thinking and sensation. In other words, idealism in philosophy and empiricism. Whereas it seems to me that things such as intuition and feeling are not represented well in Western philosophy. I was going to say it's almost as though feeling and intuition are the unconscious of Western thought, but then I wondered if I could actually apply a psychological concept to a historical period of thought. But anyway, I've said it, you can make of that what you will. I think these ideas show us the limits of philosophy. If a whole person is composed as having some sort of Dionysian or some Apollonian aspects, or some mixture of thinking, feeling, sensing and intuition, then to what extent can a discipline which ignores half of these aspects tell us much about ourselves? Or to put it another way, when people look towards academic philosophy to help understand the human condition, it is no surprise that many turn away from a discipline that deals with only a small proportion of human experience. So if I could just sum up where we've got to so far. So following Nietzsche and Jung, what we're looking for, or what I'm looking for, my sort of ground rules are something that is non-dualist, a need to integrate the Apollian and Dionysian elements, the acceptance of responsibility for creating ourselves and our values, or perhaps creating meaning from Nietzsche and from Jung, the idea of the integration of the self. So the last section, I just want to raise this term, the spiritual, and what we can mean by it. So what could we mean by the spiritual in a non-dualist world where, as I say, we've accepted responsibility to create ourselves? Of course, for many people, the term spiritual refers to a non-material part of us. And if people are to say this term spiritual refers to that, the conversation won't go on very long, because I'm trying to formulate this for a non-dualist world. If we say that the meaning of the word is in its use, it's quite clear that this term spiritual is used to mean a whole range of practices these days. So, for example, people doing yoga may be doing something they consider spiritual, but won't necessarily be part of their religion. There's something called forest bathing, I think Shinrin Yuko in Japanese, which is the idea that you can go and hang around immerse yourself in the greenness of a forest to recover from the toxicity of modern life. When I was here, last time I was here, I actually came up with the phrase epiphanies of oneness, which was, I think one of the things that we discovered last time when we talked about this was that trying to define something like the spiritual at length probably is not going to get us very far. So as well as the epiphanies of oneness that I raised last time, I do have another short phrase to try and sum this up, which is the secular spiritual is actions, techniques or practices which promote wholeness or integration. So I think this notion of oneness is quite central here. Meanings of oneness, or should I say onenessers, because there's clearly more than one sort of oneness one can have. So one meaning of oneness is the feeling of being oneself, or at least on the road to being oneself. And I don't think there's much of a contradiction between the Nietzschean Übermensch idea, the overman, the man to come, or person to come, perhaps I should say. But then there's more than one type of oneness. So there's the oneness of with things outside of oneself, oneness perhaps with a wider humanity. I think you'd find Jung more helpful here than Nietzsche, and indeed one of the weaknesses of Nietzsche's thought is it really doesn't help us in interacting with other people very much, or I'll wait here from others to prove me wrong on that. And then we also have the idea, not only just wider humanity, but oneness with something greater than oneself, which might be the totality of nature and so on. I see no problem with being a non-dualist and also thinking that there might be something greater than oneself. I don't think it's necessary to have some kind of platonic form or Big Daddy in the sky. I think it's perfectly possible to, if one is a non-dualist, to see the whole of nature as continuous and still be aware of something greater than oneself. And there's one last concept I want to mention with regard to spirituality, which is the idea of transcendence. So the question is spirituality solely about the improvement of the self? Or should there be a need to perhaps transcend the self to something greater than oneself? So, for example, let's imagine somebody going to yoga a couple of times a week, having Jungian counselling and popping to these philosophy things. But, perhaps they live a very selfish life because they're actually so concerned with developing themselves that they're not actually forming these links with other people. Would we call that kind of person spiritual? They might say so, but I wonder. So if one is to transcend from oneself, beyond oneself, what does that mean? Again, given that I'm searching for a non-dualist thing, I think it's possible to transcend oneself socially, in other words, with socially and culturally with other people. And it may also be possible to have experiences, what I called epiphanies of oneness last time I was here, where one feels perhaps part of nature or something greater. So to some extent I can see that really what I've done in the last 15 minutes or so in this talk is to swap religious concepts about spirituality and so on for psychological ones. So in other words, instead of seeing like the answer to these questions to be some other world or some God in the sky, that in fact what we've done is taking back that projection that I mentioned when I was talking about Feuerbach. But to complete now, what I wonder is what we have done in this almost this journey from God to self, have we replaced one myth of a possibly non-existent entity? I'm not actually qualified enough to know whether God exists or not, with another perhaps non-existent entity, the self, because I think the concept of the self is just as problematic as the concept of God, but that's a question rather than, it could equally be a whole new discussion, but that's my question at the end. Have we kind of fetishized the notion of the self instead of fetishizing the notion of God?
Thank you.